Right. Hello, welcome back. I hope you can hear me well. I think, so we're here to, my name is Veronique Kiermer. First, I should introduce myself. I'm the executive editor at PLOS, the Public Library of Science. And it's a big honor to moderate this panel discussion. It is an interesting meeting in the sense that we're discussing a fairly narrow and very pragmatic element of transparency, which is transparency in reporting and how this can actually have a bigger impact on reproducibility in general. I think you've heard in the first session, the first panel, that this very narrow element, transparency in reporting, is actually inscribed in a much bigger picture in a very complex ecosystem, in a system that is really based on where the challenges are based on culture and on incentive structures. So, you know, we really have, and I think what really came true in this first session was the importance of coordination between the different actors. And so what I would like to do in this particular panel with our panelist here is to actually take a look at a specific field of research that has for a very long time put a lot of attention on transparency in reporting, and that's the field of clinical research. So even though our workshop today is really focused on sort of basic biological and biomedical sciences, I think it's very helpful to turn to clinical research, where a lot of activity has actually taken place and where there are lessons that we can learn from the experience of that field. So, and one example, since we are talking about reporting, one example I wanted to bring to you is the experience that this field has had with reporting guidelines. And you're probably familiar with the consort reporting guideline, which has been developed since the mid-90s to improve the reporting of clinical trials, of parallel clinical trials. And it's actually a very remarkable story. I mean, it started, this development of these guidelines for improving the transparency and reporting of trials started in the mid-90s. I think in 1996, the first consort statement was put out. It was revised about 5 years later in 2001. And finally, the version of consort that we're using today was actually revised in 2010. So this is really, this has been an evolution over 20 years now. And it has been very interesting. There were some key elements in the process. In 2008, what was previously the work of working groups basically formalized into the Equator Network, that is now the custodian of the consort guideline, and is also has expanded these initiatives to many different areas of reporting of health research, and the consort guidelines themselves have been extended for some particular trials. An important, I mean, the reason why I'm particularly interested in the story of consort from a journal editor's perspective is that around 2005, the ICMGE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, decided to endorse the consort guideline and to make it, to ask their members to make it mandatory to submit a clinical trial to a journal to actually have filled out these reporting guidelines. And that drove to a sea change in the adoption of the guidelines. And really and there have been studies after, retrospective studies looking at before and after, which has demonstrated that actually the adoption of this guideline by journals has improved the reporting of clinical trials. Now, it's not one, there's still a lot to do about reporting clinical trials better, but this is an example of something that has had an impact. And so, but as a journal editor, this is a very inspiring story, and as a journal editor who has been involved in trying to develop guidelines in basic biomedical research, what has become also very evident is that journals, and somebody has mentioned it before today, journals play their role at the end of the process, when the research has been conducted, has been designed, conducted, and it's just reported. And so it's really the right place about reporting guidelines. But at the same time, if something wasn't done well, or if something wasn't tracked well, it's very late to be actually intervening at that point. Which means that for researchers, it's really difficult to actually comply with these guidelines if the first time they look at it is at the time of journal submission. So it's really important, I think, to turn to actors who are affecting and interacting researchers earlier in the process, at the funding stage, the institutions that are supporting the researchers in their pursuit of research, and to understand what these different actors can do in coordination with journals to actually improve that transparency and reporting. And so the panelists that we have today here bring really different perspectives to this debate. They all have experience with clinical research in different settings. And I'm going to introduce them really briefly and just tell you the perspective that I think they bring, but obviously we will hear from them. I would refer you to their bios in the handouts that were out there. First, we will hear from An-Wen Chan, who is a field scientist at Women's College Research Institute and an associate professor at the University of Toronto. An-Wen is a clinical epidemiologist and a skin cancer surgeon. He really brings the perspective of the clinical researcher, the active clinical researcher, but also he has acted as chair of the international initiative called SPIRIT, which is another set of reporting guidelines to improve quality in clinical trial protocols. And so his perspective will be very important from the point of view of guidelines development. Geeta Swamy is the Vice Dean for Scientific Integrity and the Associate Vice President for Research at Duke University. She is an Associate Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology as well at Duke. And so her perspective, I think, will really be the institutional perspective, and I hope she will share her experience in developing a culture of research integrity within an institution. And last but not least, Magali Haas is the CEO and president of Cohen Veterans Bioscience, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to fast-tracking the development of diagnostic tests and personal therapeutics for veterans and civilians who suffer from trauma-related and other brain disorders. She has a very rich experience in the pharmaceutical industry. She's bringing that experience to the panel today, and also as a developer of tools and technologies to facilitate the process of therapeutic development and reporting. She's also going to give us the perspective of a funder with her current organization. So I hope you will agree with me that this is a very nice and broad breadth of expertise we have here. And so without further ado, I would want to pass the microphone to An-Wen. The speakers, you have the choice of speaking at the podium or staying seated. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. We will hold all questions for the Q&A after, and similarly to the previous panel, we'll have a discussion among panelists and then opening up for questions from the audience.